Welcome back to Political Connections. I'm Yvette Brusoir. We continue now with our interview with Brian Williams, Democratic candidate for state attorney in the 9th Circuit. Here's News 13's Christine Webb.
You know, we mentioned it briefly, but we want to get straight to it. Talking about both your opponents in the Democratic primary, Lawson Lamar and Jeff Ashton, obviously both involved in the Casey Anthony trial last year, which was obviously watched not only locally, nationally, but internationally. And as we all know, Casey Anthony was found not guilty on the murder charges, but guilty on the 4 misdemeanor charges of providing false information. So my question to you is, do you think that this primary election will be a referendum on that verdict?
It's hard to say. My perception thus far is that the public has not really held Lawson and Jeff accountable for the outcome. What's interesting about the case is every time you prosecute a case and you go to trial, if the state believes it has enough evidence, it's made that decision, particularly to go after the death penalty, then you're saying that you should win. That's the odds, that's the way it should work in criminal court. And they didn't. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but I'm hoping that the public will take a look at the outcome of that case for what it represents. What I believe it represents is exactly what we talked about earlier, a lack of trust in our office and in our criminal justice system more broadly. I think the jury believed that the state overreached a little bit, and combine that with some of the antics in court, and you end up getting the result that you do.
Let's talk a little bit about this, because I know that we were talking earlier. You get asked a lot about Casey Anthony. What do some people ask you, and kind of how do you handle it?
They ask what I think about the case and what it represents, and do I think she was guilty. And my thoughts on her guilt, in a sense, are really irrelevant because it's what you can prove as a prosecutor. I do think it was a black eye for our criminal justice system. Whenever you seek death on a person, that's a very, very, very serious decision. And when you walk away with misdemeanors, I don't know that there's any way to view that except as something went wrong somewhere. What bothers me is the failure to evaluate what went wrong. Nobody's really asking the question, well, why did this happen? And nobody's asked Mr. Lamar, to my knowledge, what do you think you did wrong, or what happened with the case that ended up with the result that it did? Everybody's sort of implicitly blaming the jury, which should never happen, but if it's not the jury's fault, then whose fault is it? And I think that's the kind of self-examination that the office should be undergoing.
Let's go one step further and say, if you had been handling this case, how would you have handled things differently? In
hindsight. It's always in hindsight. I think the case was overcharged, and I do think that when you then also add to that the death penalty decision, you know, at the end of the day, the state couldn't prove the cause of death in the case. I mean, they knew it was homicide, but they couldn't say how it happened, and I think that sort of snowballed with the jury. And again, this is in hindsight because I believe Linda Drain Burdick presented the case very flawlessly in court. She was organized and the presentation was fantastic. I think the mistakes were made beforehand. And the question is, who makes those mistakes? You know, I've heard back and forth between Jeff and Lawson. Well, he said it was a death penalty. No, he said it was a death penalty. And at the end of the day, they're both responsible. Lawson Lamar is responsible for making the final decision as the elected state attorney. And Jeff was influential, very influential, in making sure that the death penalty was sought.
Do you think it was an all or nothing mentality?
I think if that's what it was, that's a very dangerous way to go about prosecuting cases. I think aggravated manslaughter of a child, which is a first-degree felony, 30 years in prison. I'm confident that Judge Perry would have given her 30 years in prison had that happened. And all you have to do is prove culpable negligence. So the story about the child falling in the pool, that could be culpable negligence, and you could stand up and make that argument. And we see the similar argument with Trayvon Martin and charging in that case. I think that prosecutors of a different generation are living in a time before CSI and before the juries were exposed to television and had expectations that are differently. So we have to do two things. We have to adjust our expectations and make sure we file cases that we can prove. We also have to get out in the community and regain their trust.
Let's talk about another high-profile case, that being the Cady killings. And you had remarked saying that the state attorney's office bungled the job when it came to the accused killer, Jesse Davis.
What happened was they had two opportunities to sentence Jesse Davis to prison. In both cases, the legal score sheet required him to go to prison. In one case, he got credit time served, 146 days. In another case, he was put on probation. the number one job of the state attorney, especially to use resources efficiently, is to make sure we differentiate between the dangerous and the dumb, or the dangerous and the addicts. Prison is for dangerous people who cannot be at liberty without endangering others' safety. Rehabilitation programs like probation are for people who make a mistake and we want to go out and get a job and do better for our society as a whole.
So how do we strike a balance between keeping the bad guys locked up and not spending a fortune on all of that?
You have to do just that. You have to make sure you're only sending the dangerous people to prison, because prison is costly. In fact, it's an average of $10,000 to incarcerate somebody for a year versus $4,000 to do treatment. And more importantly, you said, how do we do that? You have to have good people making those decisions. You need experienced people with an eye for detail who can identify the Jesse Davises of the world and look at criminal histories, and more importantly, perhaps have the time to do that. The state attorney's office in the Ninth Circuit struggles with massive caseloads every day, and those people do an excellent job. I saw it when I was in the office. But you have to bring those caseloads down, and one way you can do that is by filing cases that you're sure you can prove.
Very quickly, last question. Do you think the state attorney should be involved in day-to-day prosecution of cases, even if it's just symbolically one a year?
Yes. The state attorney, and I as state attorney, would try at least a couple of cases every year. It allows you to manage your people. How can you know in an office full of trial lawyers what's going on and how your trial lawyers are performing if you're never there?
All right, Ryan Williams, we certainly appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Christine.
News 13's Christine Webb with state attorney candidate Ryan Williams. And now it's time for this week's Political Connections viewer poll. We want to know the following. Do you think the Casey Anthony verdict will be the deciding factor in the state attorney's race? Log on to cfnews13.com/politics and cast your vote. We'll have the results Monday morning during your morning news on News 13. Stay with us. Political Connections will be right back.